most water they've ever had. Water will start warming a little bit now. We'll have to go fishing. For me, I can go fishing. Where do you go fishing?
Check.
You don't know?
Check. Check, check, test. Check, test, 1, 2.
You just like to catch, huh? No. It doesn't bother you.
Good evening. I have just a couple announcements to start with before we begin tonight. There is an area-wide teen devotional that was scheduled for this Sunday, has been moved to April 7th. So there's no area-wide devotional this week. It's been rescheduled April 7th. There will be a meeting after morning services this Sunday for those interested in the Hogback mission trip. You're invited to a game night next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. It says here sandwiches will be provided. That may be the menu may be altered, but I was just talking to Dawn about the one last night. There were about 14 or 15 people here. He said they had a good time, so that's scheduled again for next Tuesday night. And you ask Dawn if you have any questions about that. And then all men are invited to meet at the building for breakfast and fellowship March 30th at 8 o'clock for breakfast and a time of fellowship. Any other announcements before we begin tonight? All right.
Number 557. Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind and soul and strength to serve the King of Kings. Rise up, O men of God, His kingdom tarries long. Bring in the day of brotherhood and in the night of wrong. Rise up, O men of God, the church for you doth wait. Her strength unequal to her test, rise up and make her great. Rise up the cross of Christ, tread where His feet have trod, as brothers of the Son of Man. Rise up, O men of God.
Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you for this day and thank you for this time that you have allowed us to come here to study your word and be with fellow Christians of like mind and like faith, and be with us now as we go to our classes, be with the teachers and help them to bring us the lessons that they have prepared, and be with all of those who could not make it today, whether they be sick or traveling. Please help them get well and return to their destination soon. And that's all I pray in your Son's name. Amen.
Well, Gary should know better than to go out of town and give me 5 chapters to cover, but we'll see what we can do. And Tell him where we left off, I guess. Sorry, I'm fighting with this thing. I feel like I'm being, somebody sneaking up on me if it gets in, can't turn my head or I think I'm getting attacked. All right, so we are in Genesis. We're ready for chapter 44 tonight, but just kind of a recap of where we've been over the last couple of weeks. Joseph has found himself sold into slavery in Egypt, and once there he came to rule over Potiphar's house, and in Potiphar's house met with great success until Mrs. Potiphar tried to do things that should not have been done, and then had him thrown into prison. And so he's in prison for a little while, and it's not too long in prison before he's running the prison, and he's in charge of everything there. And so in prison he meets up with the head baker and the wine taster for Pharaoh, and while they're in prison is able to interpret their dreams. Their dreams come about just as Joseph says that they would, and the wine taster guy, when he heads back to Pharaoh's service, forgets all about Joseph until Pharaoh has a dream. And once Pharaoh has a dream that nobody can interpret, the wine taster guy remembers, oh yeah, there was a guy in prison by the name of Joseph that told me what my dream meant. And so Joseph comes out of prison to meet with Pharaoh and interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And what does he tell Pharaoh his dreams are all about? 7 years of plenty, 7 years of good crops, and then followed by 7 years of severe drought. And so Joseph, in kind of as a sidebar with the interpretation of those dreams, launches off into advising Pharaoh of what he should do in order to prepare for those 7 years of famine. And he tells Pharaoh, you need to put somebody in charge of collecting all of the excess grain for the 7 years of plenty, so that when the 7 years of famine hit, we have plenty of grain to eat during the famine. And you know, it's interesting that Joseph ventures into that territory of advice giving when really what he's been brought forward for is to just interpret the dreams. But he boldly takes that step to take that risk to tell Pharaoh what Pharaoh needs to do, because that could be a dicey deal if you try to give Pharaoh advice and he doesn't like it. But Pharaoh likes Joseph's advice. In fact, he likes it so much that he puts Joseph in charge. Well, if this guy can interpret dreams and God is able to do that through him, he's just the guy we need in order to see us through this time. So Joseph is in charge for the 7 years of plenty. How much grain did they put away? More than they could, so much that they stopped counting. They didn't even know how much it was because there was just too much to give number to. And so they store all that grain, and then the famine hits. And who shows up on the scene once the famine hits? His brothers. 10 of his brothers come down from Canaan because the famine is severe in Canaan as well. And so Jacob sends his 10 sons, and who does he not send? Benjamin, because he wants to protect Benjamin. Benjamin's the new favorite now that Joseph is believed to be dead. And so he's protecting Benjamin, doesn't let him go. And the 10 brothers go down and they buy grain, and when they get back on their way, what do they find in their sack with the grain? Their money. And so Joseph had arranged it so that their money was put back in their sacks. And then they, let's see, where do we get to? Okay, so in chapter 43, they have to return to Egypt again, but Jacob doesn't want to send Benjamin. But Joseph has told them, don't come back unless you bring that younger brother, because I think you're a spy anyway. He's just messing with them. But so they bring Benjamin back, and what happens? Let's see, I got to remember where we're starting at here. It's all running together now. Okay, so in chapter 44, they've been down, and Joseph has seen Benjamin, and he loads them up with their grain to go back on the way. And what does Joseph command his steward to do?
Put their money back, but also put my cup.
Put each man's money back in his sack, just like the last time, and put my cup in whose bag? In Benjamin's sack. And so they travel off on their way, and they just get out of town, and what happens?
Come and get them.
Yeah.
You would think that the last experience that they would check before they left.
You would think, yeah, that that's a good point. Last time we left, our money was in the top of our sacks. Let's just check here real quick before we leave town. But they didn't. And they get on their way, and Joseph sends the cavalry after them and says, why did you have abused my Lord's generosity. You have abused Joseph's generosity to you, and you have stolen from him. And how do they respond when accused of stealing?
Find it puts to death, put the one to death.
Yeah.
That if it's found,
Yeah. So.
whoever has it, but we don't have it.
Yeah, and so they said to him, this is a false accusation. We haven't done this. We've proven ourselves to be trustworthy because last time our money was in our sacks, and when we came down this time, we brought it back. We tried to give you that money back because we had the money. We didn't intend for that to happen. And so we've proven ourselves to be trustworthy. And so they believe that they're on good standing here. And in verse 9, he says, with whomever of your servants is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves. So the one who has it is sentenced to death, and the rest of us will go back as your slaves. That's the offer that they've made. And so they begin searching bags, and they begin with the oldest and search the youngest, and it's found in Benjamin's sack. How do they respond when it's found in Benjamin's sack? Yeah. It's a sign of mourning. It's a sign of lament that they have torn their clothes. They are dumbstruck. They don't know how this happened. They don't know what to do about it. They tear their clothes as a sign of lament. So they return to the city. Why this elaborate scheme? Why does Joseph arrange all of this?
Well, we have the benefit of hindsight here, but Joseph is, that's one way of getting Benjamin, keeping him there.
Yeah.
And everything, and of course, I think that probably, Joseph was thinking, I keep Benjamin here, that's gonna bring my father here, and I'm gonna have my father back.
Yeah. There could be some of that to it.
I really don't, I don't know, maybe he cared enough to warn his brothers there, his other brothers there, but I think he really wanted Benjamin there, and he wanted his father there.
I think those are the two closest, the two people that he feels closest to and cares most about. Jesse? I think there's a little bit of twist it, make them twist a little bit, make them hurt, make them feel it. I think he could have he could have gone about this in a much gentler way, revealing himself to them. I think that what he's doing here is he is testing his brothers, because what was it that caused them to betray him in the first place? Why did they sell him? They were jealous because he was the favorite of their father. Who now is the favorite? And here they have the chance, because what Joseph offers is he stays a slave, the rest of you go. That's exactly what happened to Joseph. And he is offering them that as the chance to get rid of the last favorite. And if they take it, then he knows that their character has been revealed, if they take that deal. Because they can make up a story on the way home about Joseph, or about Benjamin, dying on the way or whatever, just like they made up a story about Joseph. And so I think he's offering them enough rope to hang themselves and seeing what they're going to do with it. That's always the way I've read it, to see if they are going to treat Benjamin the same way they treated Joseph. So how do they respond when Joseph places this deal on the table? You leave him as my slave, and the rest of you go home. What happens?
They're in between a rock and a hard place, because they know they know that if they don't bring Benjamin back, that they're going to face the wrath of Jacob.
Yeah.
And now they're facing the wrath of Joseph, but even though they don't know he's Joseph.
Yeah.
So they're stuck. They're really stuck.
Yeah.
They're in a hard place.
Yeah.
Because they promised their dad they'd bring Benjamin back.
Who steps up here? Judah. Just like he told his dad he would, when it's time, Jacob is saying, you've got to go back and get more food, and Judah says, we can't go back. Unless we take Benjamin with us, we can't go. And if you allow Benjamin to go with us, then I will be a surety for his life. I will place my life in his place if the need arises. And Judah does exactly that. He steps up, and he even tells Joseph, if you look down to like verse 30, now therefore, this is Judah speaking, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant our father down to Sheol in sorrow. So Judah is admitting to Joseph, Benjamin's dad's favorite. Dad's life is tied up in Benjamin, and if Benjamin doesn't go home with us, Dad will die. And so, if I don't go home, Dad will be sad, but he'll live. But if Benjamin doesn't go home, he will die. And so Judah is offering his life in exchange for Benjamin's. And so, how does that offer go over? Yeah. Beginning of chapter 45, how does Joseph respond? He can't control himself. He's hearing Judah take up for Benjamin in a way that nobody took up for him. Reuben and Judah, to some extent, spared Joseph's life. They were,
He doesn't know that.
he probably heard Reuben to some extent saying, spare him maybe, but he doesn't know the full extent, I think. And so here he hears Judah defending Benjamin, putting his father first, all of those things. And so Joseph understands that the brothers have learned their lesson. They're not the same men they were when they sold him into slavery. And so Joseph can't contain himself. He sends all of his servants out, have everyone go out from him. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the house of Pharaoh heard of it. So his servants outside in other rooms heard Joseph wailing, and they spread the rumor to Pharaoh's household, something's going on, and they heard about it. So Joseph, in verse 3, how'd you like to have been there for that scene? Verse 3, Joseph says, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? Huh?
The brothers couldn't even answer.
Yeah, I've been speechless, I suppose, a few times in my life, but they were really speechless. They didn't know what to say. I imagine it took a little bit of convincing for Joseph to be able to say. In fact, in verse 4, please come closer to me. They came closer, and he's convincing them, I am your brother Joseph, with whom you sold into Egypt. So, how does Joseph explain to his brothers the series of events that have taken place? What perspective does Joseph give to his brothers?
It's all in God.
Yeah, it was God's plan. You guys thought you were in control. You thought you knew what you were doing. You thought you were the ones that were in charge of all of these things that were happening. But you guys had no idea what was happening. God was in control the whole time. Look at a couple of verses. Just look at verse 5. Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Look at verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Verse 8, now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. Verse 9, Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt.
You know, you gotta wonder when Joseph came to that realization. You know, I mean, if you look at his life at this, up to this point, from the time that he was sold into slavery, his faith still remained strong.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything he did, you know, he gives God the credit for. You know, he gives
Right.
God credit for interpreting the dreams and everything like that, you know.
Yeah.
And he, you know, somewhere along the line, from age 17 to now, you know, I mean, this must have struck him. God is behind this. God is taking care of me. God is providing for me. So for some reason or another, you know, he may not
Yeah.
have known
Yeah.
up until this point or whatever. You know, he may not have known
Yes.
what his purpose was, but he realized that God had provided for
Yeah.
him. God had done this for a reason.
I think you're exactly right. And I can, you know, Joseph at age 17 being sold into slavery, finding himself in Potiphar's house, and even at that young age, you know, saying to Potiphar's wife, how can I do this evil and do this sin and commit this evil and sin against my God? Realizes that God is in the picture the whole time. God has been in the picture for Joseph the whole way. But the full understanding of why God was doing what God was doing, I think maybe is not realized until his brothers show up on the scene, and Joseph realizes, this is why you brought me here. Because my family had to be saved, and how was that going to happen if I wasn't here to save them? And so what a tremendous story of faith it is for Joseph to be able to say all along the way that God is in control, God is in control all the way through. And then finally, what is this? We talked about it the other night. Is this like 19 years later or something? Joseph is in his 30s. He's in his late 30s now at this point. So more than 20 years he has been in Egypt away from his family, and now I understand why. I didn't understand why. I trusted, I had faith, but I didn't know why. Now I get it. And so, man, what a great lesson that is for us, that, you know, God sees that whole picture. He sees from the very beginning until the very end of time, and he understands how our little piece of it fits kind of wedged in there in that speck of a moment. To us, it feels like, you know, it's a lifetime. It feels like forever. But to God, it's just that moment, and he sees from one end to the next, and he understands how all of it fits together. And so that's a tremendous lesson for us from the life of Joseph. So this whole episode with Joseph reveals himself, and what assurances does he give his brothers at this point?
He wants them to move closer.
Yeah. Go home, get Dad, bring him back here. And I want to provide for you. You're gonna have the best of the land. You're gonna have a place to live. You're gonna be able to survive the famine. I'm going to be able to provide for you. You know, everything. He's just making promise after promise that he's going to be able to take care of them.
And God put him in a place where he could stand by those promises.
Yeah, and they're not empty promises. Who's the only person that can tell Joseph what to do? Pharaoh. That's the only man that has any say over what Joseph does, because he's second in command behind only Pharaoh. And so Joseph is in a position to be able to care for his family. He sends them on their way. In verse 16, it was heard in Pharaoh's household that Joseph's family had come. And it's interesting, in verses 17 and verse 19, Pharaoh said to Joseph in verse 17, say to your brothers. This is a direct statement. He's telling him, tell them this. Say to your brothers, do this. Load your beasts, go to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your household and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. And then verse 19, now you are ordered. Say this, do this. So Pharaoh is taking it out of Joseph's hands. He's not saying, Joseph, if you want him to come down here, bring him down. Pharaoh is saying, Joseph, provide for your family, do this. I mean, as if it's not enough for Joseph to have confirmed to him through the events that have taken place that God has put him in a position to save his family, Now the one man on the planet that could possibly derail this is doing exactly what Joseph knows he's been put here to do. He's telling him to follow through on God's plan. And so it's just giving that extra little push in Joseph's mind that this is exactly what he is here for. I love what Pharaoh says, take the wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and load your wives and bring your father and come. Leave your stuff behind. Don't even pack. Just leave it all there, because when you get here, we're going to give you the best of what we have. That sounds like a dream move to me, if you could move without having to pack. Just leave it all behind. And so that would be great. So Pharaoh more than makes good on the promises that Joseph has already made to his family. He has just completely backed up what Joseph said was going to happen. As we go into the end of chapter 45 there, they get Joseph's parting word to his brothers in verse 24.
Don't fight.
Don't quarrel on the way. Sounds like my dad when we started the trip when I was little. But no, but don't quarrel on the way. Don't blame each other. Don't point fingers. Don't worry about retribution. Don't worry about it. This is all good. There's nothing to worry about. So they went to Jacob, and in verse 26, if it would have been great to see the reaction of the brothers when Joseph revealed himself, wouldn't it have been even greater to see Jacob's reaction when they come to him and they say, Joseph is still alive, and he's the ruler of Egypt. What a jaw-dropping moment. Yeah. He was stunned, for he did not believe them. But, they convince him. Verse 28, it is enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go see him before I die. That sums it up. Chapter 46. What happens when Jacob and his family arrive at Beersheba on their way to Egypt? Okay. What's the very first thing they do? Offer sacrifices. Look back at 26. In chapter 26, we have Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac had settled in the land of Gerar, I don't know what it said, and Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and they were trying to settle in the area together. But Isaac's flocks had become so large that they got in conflict with the Philistines, and they tried to dig a well, and the Philistines would take the well over and push Isaac out of the way, and all those things. So in verse, if you look like in verse 20, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying the water is ours. And they dug another well in verse 21, and he moved away from there and dug another well. They did not quarrel over it, so he named it Rehoboth. So he said, at last the Lord has made room for us, we will be fruitful. Then he went up from there to Beersheba. And what did he do at Beersheba? Okay, the Lord appeared to him at Beersheba. In verse 25, this is Isaac and Rebekah. So in verse 25, he built an altar there, called upon the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. This is where Isaac settled down. This is where Isaac went to live. Later on, we have in chapter 27 Jacob's deception. This is where Jacob grew up. This is Jacob's boyhood home, Beersheba. And so Jacob may very well remember that conflict that led to his father having to resettle a couple of times, and finally ending up in Beersheba and building that altar and calling on the name of the Lord there and pitching his tent there for that kind of that final settlement. And so Jacob remembers this place. Look at chapter 28. At the beginning of chapter 28, Isaac calls Jacob and blesses him and tells him, you can't take a wife from here. You've got to go back to my family and take a wife from my family, or from your mother's family. And look at verse 10. So Jacob departs from Beersheba. That's Jacob's boyhood home. This is where he has lived. And so this is where he has those memories of Isaac calling on the name of the Lord during his lifetime, during his early lifetime. And now Jacob, as he passes through that region, what does he do? He stops, and he maybe on the very same altar that his dad had built, maybe on that very same spot where Isaac had placed the altar before, offers that sacrifice and calls out to God. And what does God tell him in the vision? Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. Look back in, if you still have your finger in chapter 26, when the Lord appeared to Isaac in that same spot. What did God promise to Isaac? I will, in chapter 26, verse 24, I will bless you and multiply your descendants. That's the promise that God makes to Isaac in the very same spot that now God is making that promise to Joseph, or to Jacob, sorry. So it's kind of an important spot, kind of an important place for the story, the unfolding of the story of God keeping his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they make their trip down, and we won't get into the whole, we don't have to read the names of all those. There's some fun ones in like verse 21 has some of my favorite Bible names. At the end of the verse, Muppum, Huppum, and Ard. Those are some of my favorite names. I don't know why we could name our sons Muppum and Huppum. No comment. All right. Towards the end of the chapter, as they get down, in verse 28, he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way into Goshen, and they came to the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot, and he went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Once again, what a reunion. Wouldn't you love to have seen that? Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I've seen your face, that you are still alive. What is the plan for, as some of them are going to go meet Pharaoh? Why not all of them, first of all? Kind of a big crowd, right? And so he's just going to take a couple of the brothers, I think it was 5 of them, wasn't it? And his dad, and they go to meet Pharaoh. And what is the plan for that Joseph devises to get them to convince Pharaoh to let them live where they want to live? I don't know if I said that right, but they have a plan. Well, to put them to work, but they want to live in a specific area, Goshen. And why do they want that area? It's because it's good grazing for their flocks. And so when Joseph coaches them up a little bit, and when Pharaoh asks, what is it that you do, what are they supposed to tell him? We're shepherds. And how does Egyptians feel about shepherds? Loathsome. That's a nasty profession. We don't want anything to do with people who are herders of livestock. And so that puts Pharaoh in a, if Pharaoh is going to do the typical thing of that day and age of showing the kind of hospitality that he has at his fingertips to be able to show, it might be that Pharaoh feels some burden that he needs to give them a palace right next door to his or something, right? But we don't want that to happen. We want to be off kind of on our own family land anyway. And so how do we convince Pharaoh that it's okay to let us live out away from, downtown Egypt, whatever city they were in? We're shepherds. We keep livestock. And so Pharaoh says, oh, well, this is the best thing I can give you then. The best thing I can give to shepherds is the land of Goshen. And so that puts Pharaoh in a position where he can give them the best and still keep them away. And so plan succeeds. They get to live out in the land of Goshen. How old is Jacob when Pharaoh asks? 130 years old. I might have jumped ahead a little bit there into the next chapter. But yeah, I've jumped ahead a little bit, I think. But it kind of runs together. Okay, so he puts them in Goshen where they wanted to be anyway. And also, what other little thing does Pharaoh say? If you have anyone who's really good at tending livestock, put them in charge of mine. You imagine there was somebody already in charge of Pharaoh's livestock? Well, what about that guy? But maybe he was an Egyptian and he didn't want the job anyway because they, I don't know. Maybe Pharaoh was cutting the guy some slack. So they are doing, I mean, could it be any more obvious that God has rolled out the red carpet for them to come into Egypt to be taken care of through this time of famine? I mean, God has done everything he can do to provide for them in this difficult time.
But isn't it interesting that, livestock's loathsome to them, but yet that was what his dream was.
Yeah. The cattle came up out of the Nile. Yeah. That may have been one of the reasons it was so disconcerting to him. Dreaming about cows, that can't be a good sign.
It's like they wanted all the benefit, but to actually tend to them was
Yeah.
loathsome.
I don't, it doesn't say specifically what they loathed about them, but if you've driven through Dodge City, maybe that, there's some things I loathe about that drive. Maybe it was just that. So Jacob and his family settle in. They are given the best of everything that they could ever want. And the famine, though, still has 5 more years, right? And so what happens as the famine progresses? Yeah. Joseph is a shrewd man. Joseph, I don't think this is I don't think this was a accidental thing. I don't think it was a moment of opportunity where Joseph thought, "Oh, I have an idea." Joseph's been planning this out for years. He's collected everything that they have as far as extra grain. He knows that he has all the grain in the world. There is no other grain to be found. And so now he starts selling it back to the Egyptian people. And at first, he sells it back and gets all of what? Gets all of their money. They have no money left. And at the point that they have no money left, look down to verse 15. When all the money was spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." So what does Joseph want next? Livestock. Why do they even have livestock? They think they're gross. Give up all your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. By the way, who is it that now takes care of all the livestock in the land of Egypt? Joseph's family. That's kind of neat. So they brought down, I'm sure, the flocks they had, but now they have all of them. They have all of the flocks of Egypt that they are now caring for in Goshen, since your money is gone. So they brought them, and he fed them with food in exchange for the livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said, "We'll not hide from our Lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my Lord's. There's nothing that we have except our bodies and our land." So what does Joseph say? "I'll take it. If that's all you got to give, then that's what we'll take." And so in verse 20, Joseph bought all of the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. Whose land did not become Pharaoh's? The priests. Because they were given an allotment, a portion by Pharaoh every year anyway. And so they didn't have to barter for their food because Pharaoh gave them their food to care for them. And so as you can imagine, what position that put the priests in over the people. If they were already powerful, if they were already had sway over the people, now, besides Pharaoh, they're the only ones who own anything. And so they would have become very, very powerful at that point. So then, verse 23, now he has all their land, now what? Yeah. You know, if the land's not mine, Ryan, if someone came and took all your land away from you, would you go out and plant and sow that land next year?
I would probably question.
Yeah, I probably would not feel real motivated to go out and sow seed in the land that was no longer mine. And so we got to strike a deal here, and Joseph strikes a deal with them, and he says to the people, behold, I've bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here's seed for you, and you may sow the land. It's interesting, this is like year 4 of the famine, isn't it? 4 or 5? And, you know, he's still giving them seed to go out and sow. He has them working the land. And so that's what farmers do. Farmers sow. And sometimes they get a harvest, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be favorable to the Pharaoh to have land that they're doing nothing with.
Yeah.
Because then it'd be worthless.
Right.
So, and that's another thing, that he probably thought of is like, this keeps it good and everything, and so it's to my advantage to have him work the land and keep things up and, make it, that way it just doesn't,
It also keeps them busy so they don't revolt.
Yeah. Keeps them busy,
yeah.
and with a job so that they're earning wages. They're basically, in a sense, they're earning food to care for themselves so they don't have to worry about, because they don't have any money, they don't have anything to go out and buy food with, so they're going to earn it. And if they want to eat, they better do some work. Jesse?
Yeah, I thought during this period of time they were having a famine, so how could they really expect to grow very much?
Well, that's a good question. And Joseph, we know, trusted in what God's plan was for the 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. I don't know if they just broadcast out there, hey, we've had our 7 good years, now we know there are going to be 7 bad years, so everybody just, sit back and do nothing for 7 years. I don't picture that being the message that they would put out there. And so maybe it's, this is what we do. Every year in the spring we sow our crops. And it's springtime, we're going to sow our crops even though there's no moisture.
People have to have something
Yeah.
to do or they'll get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, even if they didn't get much of the crop, it kept them engaged.
Yeah, and it kept them with a sense of it kept them tied to the land, even though it wasn't theirs anymore. Gave them a sense of purpose for what they were doing.
It also keep the wind and the rain or the sand down.
Keep
The people that live Lubbock,
erosion.
Texas,
Yeah,
they know what a haboob is, and that's a big sandstorm.
we don't like sandstorms.
So that helped keep
Yeah.
the sand down.
Okay.
I think there was times in the 30s when they planted wheat one year and it really didn't come up until the next year with that drought.
Okay.
And so, you broadcast that seed and at some point,
Okay. Because it can lay dormant. It can lay dormant for some time before it does come up. Okay. It's good to have farmers in the crowd. You know way more than I do about that stuff. So that's the progression. Joseph is, do you think there's ever any time along the way that Pharaoh says, I think I could have found somebody better for this job? Joseph has proven his worth from the time he reached Potiphar's house. Everything that he touched for Potiphar flourished. When he was put in charge of the prison ran smoothly. When he was brought in and put in charge of this, everything that he touches is blessed. And so all along the way, Pharaoh's got to have the easiest job it's the easiest Pharaoh job there ever was, probably, because Joseph's running everything. And he doesn't have to worry about stuff. So, verse 26, Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. So out of everything they gleaned from their fields, 1/5 of it, 20% went to Pharaoh, and they kept 80% as seed for their next crops plus their food for the year. And that became a binding statute in Egypt. So meanwhile, in Goshen, what's going on?
They're acquiring property and being fruitful.
Yeah.
Very numerous.
Yep. They are, it's not a time of famine for the Jacob family. For the Israelites, they are flourishing in the land of Goshen. For how long does Jacob live in Goshen? 17 years. So he's 130 when he came to see Pharaoh, and he lives there 17 years. So at 147, he comes to a close there. So as the time comes for Israel to die draws near, he calls to his son Joseph and says to him what? Don't bury me here. This is not my home. And so take me back and bury me in the burial place of his fathers. So Joseph swears to him that he will make sure that happens.
How did Jacob know that they would one day leave?
Well, this is going to be a special trip. They're going to take him back as soon as he dies.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So in verse chapter 48, it's, behold, your father is sick. So Jacob, now I can't get the J word right. Joseph takes his two sons. And who are his two sons? Ephraim and Manasseh. And he takes them to Joseph. I can't say it right now. He takes them to Jacob. I should just say Israel. Takes them to Israel for what? For blessing. Common practice back then that, we see this all through kind of this, the Old Testament, that there's going to be a blessing of the son or a blessing of the next generation that's coming along. Jacob says to Joseph in verse 3, God appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said, behold, I'll make you fruitful and numerous, and I'll make you a company of peoples and give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. What does he mean by that? Yeah. Jacob basically is saying, Joseph, these boys are mine in your place. I am adopting your sons as though they were my sons. What does that do? What does that mean? Yeah. Remember, the way that their inheritance was divided is that, the oldest son got a double portion, and then all the remaining sons would get everything divided up evenly. And so you have Reuben, who's the oldest son, will get that double portion, but then the other 11 will each get 1/11 of what remains. But now Joseph has been given a double portion, basically. He's saying there's no longer 11, now there's 12 that are going to fill in that extra spot. And so your Ephraim and Manasseh will each get an equal share of what I have, not relying upon getting an equal share of what I'm able to give you. It's interesting that, we're talking about the second most powerful man in the world at this point, Joseph, who is wealthy beyond anything that we could imagine. And Jacob is worried about an inheritance and what portion his sons get as an inheritance. Is that what he's worried about?
It'd be the family.
It's the blessing. It's the blessing. It's the promise that God has made that's going to be distributed into the into his lineage, into his family. And so Jacob is giving Joseph's sons a double portion of God's promise. I mean, that's what he's doling out here. That's a remarkable thing. And so it's not about money. It's not about physical inheritance. It's about the keeping of God's promise.
And also, there's no tribe of Joseph. There's a tribe of
Yeah.
Ephraim and Manasseh. Maybe that makes
Right.
more sense.
Yeah, and that's why when you look at the 12 tribes, you don't find the tribe of Joseph. You find the 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh because they received that inheritance. Whereas if there had been a tribe of Joseph, then when Joseph died, that tribe would have been doled out to his sons, and Ephraim and Manasseh would have got a much smaller portion. But because they're counted as Jacob's sons, they get a full share along with the other brothers.
You're getting at this, but this may be I haven't checked it out, but this may be the last time that Manasseh is mentioned before Ephraim when he introduces
Yes.
his son.
Who is the oldest?
Manasseh.
Manasseh is the oldest. And when Jacob blesses them, what does he do? Yeah. Joseph very purposefully places Manasseh at Jacob's right hand. So places Manasseh where he will receive the right hand, which is the prominent blessing, and places Ephraim where he will receive the left hand, which is the prominent blessing. And then Jacob does the old switcheroo and switches his hands as he gives the blessings. What does Joseph try to do? Tries to move his hands. No, Dad, you're doing it wrong. You're backwards. And Joseph says, no, this is the way it's supposed to be done. Is this the first time we've ever seen the younger blessed ahead of the older? No, we see a pattern of this. Who else have we seen this happen with? Well, Jacob and Esau. That one kind of by subterfuge, although it was God's plan originally, so it didn't have to be that way. But anyone else? Say it. Perez, yeah. You remember the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. And when Tamar became pregnant, she had twins, and one of them reached his hand out, and they tied a scarlet thread onto it. And then he pulled his hand back in, and then Perez was born first. So Zerah was actually considered the oldest because he stuck his hand out first, but then Perez was born first. And so Perez supplanted his brother and became the more famous. And Perez is the one that Jesus' lineage comes through. Who else? What about Isaac and Ishmael? Isaac was the son of promise. Ishmael was the son of Abraham and Sarah's thinking, devising a plan to try to come up with a method for bringing about God's promise. But Isaac was the younger, and yet he received the blessing. And even on down the line, what about David? When they anoint a king, the 7 older brothers traipse through, and none of them are going to be the king. And so finally here comes David, and he's the youngest, but he's the one that's anointed king. What about David's own sons? Solomon's the one that finally inherits David's kingdom, and yet he wasn't the oldest. I think he was the 5th. And so there's just this kind of there's this prevailing storyline all through the Old Testament about it not going the way that it seems like it should go according to man's customs, but it always goes the way it should go according to God's plan. And I think a lot of the time it's going that way because God wants to prove that he's the one in charge. And if it always goes by the oldest son, if it always goes by the way it's supposed to go, then men will start taking credit for what is happening. But when it always goes counter to the way it's supposed to go, when it always goes the opposite of the way you think it should, then God can stand there in the background and say, that was me. I was the one who devised that. That was my plan. And so we just have this kind of prevailing storyline of the younger overtaking the older. If any of my older siblings are listening. So, I know. I just have to get those little shots in whenever I can.
But they're not here.
Well, but they might be watching. I might send it to them later. Yeah, my mom's probably watching. Sorry, Mom. Okay, well, we just got to the end of my notes.
Jason,
Yes.
do you think these blessings are miraculous?
Do I think the blessings are miraculous? I think the blessings are prophetic, in the sense that God, it's not what Joseph said or Jacob says that causes those things to happen. It's Jacob speaking by inspiration of God that reveals the plan that God has already established, is the way I would say it. So yes, in a sense, miraculous in the sense that they are a foretelling of what God is going to do, but not in the sense that Jacob is the one that's setting out a plan that God's going to make happen. Did I say that right? Okay. Keep them coming. What else?
Well, I think it's really amazing that God, in chapter 47, verse 28, it talks about, oh, that's the wrong verse. Chapter 46, 26 and 27, it talks about how many people went down to Egypt and how many there were. And then when they leave Egypt, they're by the million.
Yeah.
And God gave them the land of Goshen. I mean, you were saying that Joseph was shrewd, but I think it was God working through him to set all this up for the remnant down there to be saved and to be numerous and everything,
Yeah.
so that they could be taken back to the promised land.
I think you're exactly right, and I think kind of the same way that Jacob was revealing God's plan by the things that he said, he spoke prophetically. I think Joseph is being used in that way as well, as he gets his family to settle in the land of Goshen. That's where God wanted them, obviously. And so as Joseph is saying, hey, let's settle in the land of Goshen, it's not because it was his idea, it was God's idea revealed through him that came about. Well, you have seen something amazing that I got through 5 chapters in one night. You all were here to witness it. Thank you for your good attention, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, just been watching her. When we go on these trips down to Wichita, she always goes. Yeah, she is. Yes, yes, that's really.
Okay, all